The city of Grand Rapids was barely awake when sirens sliced through the stillness, announcing a blaze that stretched ominous shadows across Eastern Avenue. Fire Chief Maria Jensen arrived on the scene within minutes, stepping out of her truck to find an inferno raging through a modest two-story home. Flames licked at the siding, casting a dull orange glow that bathed the street in eerie light. Families from neighboring houses clustered on lawns, faces etched with shock and fear. Someone shouted, "There are kids in there." An older man pointed frantically at an upstairs window. The Grand Rapids Fire Department immediately sprang into action. Firefighters hauled hoses and axes, their silhouettes stark against the roaring blaze. Inside, the heat was punishing. Smoke snaked along the ceiling, choking visibility and stinging eyes. Yet the firefighters pressed on, systematically checking each room. On the first floor, they discovered two children, frightened but conscious, huddled near the back door. Outside, paramedics whisked them away for oxygen and first aid. The real crisis lay upstairs. Chief Jensen coordinated the rescue from the front yard, heart pounding at every update crackling through her radio. "We've got a third child, unconscious in a bedroom," came a muffled voice. Within seconds, a firefighter emerged, carrying the limp form of a 12-year-old girl. The crowd gasped. Another crew member began CPR on the front lawn, the girl's soot-streaked face and ragged breathing a testament to how close she was to death's door. For a moment, it seemed the worst had been averted. Everyone was out of the burning house. Then Jensen's experienced eyes fell on something unusual. The house was burning too intensely, too fast. It wasn't just old wiring or an accidental spark. Instinct told her this was deliberate. As the girl was rushed to an ambulance, Jensen spotted an open window near ground level, leading to a partially exposed basement. Even at a distance, she could smell the unmistakable chemical tang of lighter fluid. Alarms sounded in her mind. Local police arrived just as firefighters began to douse the final flames, and Detective Samuel Ortiz stepped onto the sidewalk, surveying the chaos. A neighbor rushed up, breathless, pointing at a disheveled woman hunched against a curb. "That's the mom, Roconda." The neighbor said quietly, "She was out here yelling that one kid was still inside, but then she just sort of froze." Detective Ortiz observed Roconda carefully. Her arms were wrapped around her knees, eyes distant, lips moving in frantic whispers. The swirl of smoke overhead and the grim swirl of paramedics made her small and solitary figure all the more striking. Fire Chief Jensen approached Ortiz, her tone grim. "This is no accident," she stated, gesturing at the scorched siding. "It spread too fast, and I'm picking up the scent of accelerant." Ortiz nodded, glancing at Roconda. "Then we need to find out who set it and why." He didn't yet know the horrifying truth that mother and suspect might be one and the same. As sunrise painted the sky with pastel hues, the last flames were extinguished. Chief Jensen radioed her team to secure the scene for a thorough investigation. In a swirl of flashing lights and drifting ash, paramedics sped the 12-year-old to the hospital, fighting to keep her alive. Meanwhile, Detective Ortiz prepared himself for the most difficult questions. How did this fire start, and who had just destroyed a family's world in mere minutes? Fire Chief Jensen stood amidst the charred wreckage hours later, the smell of burned wood and melted plastic clinging to her gear. Early inspections confirmed lighter fluid residue pooled near a couch in the living room and at the base of the stairs, an intentional setup. This was arson, and the target seemed to be the very family who lived here. Detective Samuel Ortiz ducked under yellow caution tape, stepping inside the gutted home. Blackened walls loomed around him, each step crunching under waterlogged debris. First responders had done their best to make the structure temporarily safe, but it still groaned ominously. Ortiz's gaze tracked upward, noting how the flames had consumed the second floor with startling speed. A forensics team combed the basement. One investigator beckoned Ortiz over and pointed to a plastic bag containing multiple smoke detectors. "She took them all down," he said grimly, shaking his head. "That's practically a death sentence in a house fire. No alarms to warn anyone." Ortiz frowned. "That means whoever did this wanted no chance of escape." The horrifying possibility that the children's own mother orchestrated it tightened his chest. Outside, Roconda Singleton, late 40s, hair frizzed from the morning's chaos, sat in the back of a patrol car. Earlier, she'd been near catatonic, but now she rocked back and forth, mumbling under her breath. Two children, ages 6 and 9, had been rescued from the first floor. The third, a 12-year-old girl, was fighting for her life at the hospital. Roconda kept asking if her daughter was alive, only to lapse into strange, repetitive phrases about needing to be free. Ortiz approached the patrol car cautiously. "Miss Singleton," he began, voice low, "can you tell me what happened?" Her eyes snapped up, suddenly alert. "They said I couldn't do it," she whispered. "They said I was crazy, but I had no choice." She gestured vaguely at the smoldering house. "I took them all out. The smoke detectors. I just wanted." Her voice cracked. Ortiz exchanged a glance with the officer standing nearby. This was a chilling admission, especially if it confirmed she had deliberately disabled every safety measure that might have saved her children. "Why?" he pressed gently, fighting the anger welling inside him. Tremors shook Roconda's frame as she answered. I I couldn't go on," she said at last. "We needed an escape, a reset. I'm the one who's trapped. Do you know what it's like to have the world against you?" Her words poured out in disjointed bursts, revealing hints of paranoia and despair. One moment she claimed she'd never hurt her children. The next, she insisted this was the only way to protect them from a life of misery. Meanwhile, Fire Chief Jensen joined them, her expression ashen. She offered Ortiz a small evidence bag containing a battered can of lighter fluid. "Found this in the closet," she explained quietly, then locked eyes with Roconda. "That's what started all this, isn't it?" Roconda's gaze drifted away as she retreated into murmured incoherence. Ortiz felt a surge of frustration and sorrow. He signaled the officers to take her in for a formal statement. She needed a psychiatric evaluation, and her children needed answers. As the sun climbed higher, the scorched remains of the home stood silent, except for the crackle of cooling embers. A quiet dread settled over the neighborhood. Few could comprehend how a mother might bring such devastation upon her family, but the evidence was damning. Whether Roconda's actions stemmed from deep-seated mental illness, desperation, or both, the path to justice now lay in Ortiz's hands. Detective Ortiz spent the rest of the day gathering information from neighbors and first responders. Almost everyone described Roconda Singleton as a loving but troubled mother, prone to erratic bouts of paranoia. Some recalled overhearing her talk about conspiracies or unseen enemies. Others mentioned she had lost her job a month prior and had been struggling to keep food on the table. At the police station, Ortiz sat across from Roconda in a cramped interview room. A social worker and a legal aide were present, hoping to safeguard her rights given her mental state. Roconda's gaze was unfocused, eyes darting around as though she expected someone else to appear. She repeated her claims of wanting to set them free, though it remained murky whether she intended a murder-suicide or believed some miraculous solution would arise if she lit the fire. When Ortiz brought up her children, Roconda grew momentarily lucid. "I wanted to take them with me," she mumbled, tears sliding down her cheeks. "You don't know how hard it is. Everything is stacked against me." Her torment was evident, but so was the brutal finality of her choice. The methodical removal of smoke detectors, the lighter fluid, the knowledge that her children were sleeping upstairs. Ortiz gently pressed for clarity. "So you were ready to die with them?" Roconda's eyes flared with confusion. "I just wanted to escape the pain. My kids, everyone says I'm a bad mother, but they don't see what the world does to me." She broke down in sobs, incoherent ramblings about phone taps and government watchers tumbling from her lips. Outside in the hallway, Fire Chief Jensen waited for updates. The tension in her stance betrayed her own inner conflict. She had seen accidental fires claim countless lives, but rarely a deliberate act aimed at one's own family. Quietly, she asked Ortiz, "Any word on the girl in the hospital?" He shook his head. "Still critical. 2 others have stable vitals but are traumatized." The notion that a 12-year-old might not make it gnawed at him. He'd been a detective for years, but nothing hardened you to the idea of a mother allegedly destroying her family. That afternoon, Ortiz visited the hospital to check on the children. The younger two were awake, eyes wide with fear. When he gently asked them about the fire, they clammed up, only managing tears and stammered words. The 12-year-old girl remained unconscious, her condition guarded by a flurry of doctors and nurses fighting to stabilize her lungs damaged by smoke inhalation. Ortiz spotted a nurse in the hallway, eyes brimming with urgency. "We're doing all we can," she assured him. "She's a fighter, but the smoke was thick, and it all happened so fast." The detective swallowed hard, unable to shake the image of the child being carried out of the blazing home. If Roconda's intentions were truly to end all their lives, this girl was clinging to life against impossible odds. By evening, the city's local news had picked up the story in earnest. Headlines read, "Mother arrested in fatal arson," though the 12-year-old's fate was still uncertain. Community members gathered outside the burned house, leaving flowers and notes, struggling to comprehend the horror that had unfolded. As the orange glow of dusk faded into night, Detective Ortiz sat at his desk reviewing witness statements and forensic reports. A sense of grim resolve settled over him. The puzzle pieces were clear. Roconda, in a state of paranoia or despair, had orchestrated a lethal fire. Yet one burning question remained. Was it a twisted act of misguided love, or had she simply succumbed to darkness she could no longer contain? The next morning brought a wave of heartbreak. The hospital notified the Grand Rapids Police Department that the 12-year-old girl had succumbed to her injuries during the early hours. Detective Ortiz's phone buzzed with the dreaded news. He closed his eyes briefly, steeling himself for what came next. As he arrived at the station, the atmosphere was somber. Officers who'd worked the case lowered their heads when they saw him. A homicide charge now loomed over Roconda Singleton, transforming an already devastating arson case into a murder investigation. Ortiz made his way to the holding area, where Roconda sat slumped in a chair, arms around her knees, rocking gently. She looked up at his approach, eyes hollow. "She's gone, isn't she?" Roconda whispered, as though some sixth sense had confirmed what no one dared to tell her yet. Ortiz nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I'm sorry," he offered softly, unsure what comfort could be found in words. Her reaction was not a wail or protest, but a resigned silence. "I told them," she muttered eventually, voice cracking. "I told them we had to be free." She lowered her gaze, tears sliding down her cheeks. "I failed." The legal machinery moved swiftly. The prosecutor's office added second-degree murder to the charges, and talk of a possible life sentence swirled through the precinct's halls. News outlets clamored for statements, and the fire chief was compelled to hold another press conference, confirming the child's tragic death. The community bristled with outrage and sorrow. Neighbors left teddy bears and notes in front of the scorched home, while others questioned how mental health services had failed to intervene sooner. Still, for Detective Ortiz, the case wasn't just about condemnation. He saw in Roconda a profoundly broken individual who had made an irreversibly catastrophic choice. He requested a psychiatric evaluation, hoping an expert opinion would shed light on whether she fully grasped her actions. A part of him wondered if she'd been let down by a system that missed opportunities to prevent this tragedy. Meanwhile, the surviving children, still in shock, were placed under protective custody. Ortiz visited them with a counselor. Though both remained mostly silent, their gazes haunted. He didn't push them. They'd endured too much already. Fire Chief Jensen and Ortiz convened in the remnants of the living room to retrace the sequence of events. The smell of burned wood and chemicals hung in the air. Jensen pointed to the scorched subfloor. She poured lighter fluid here, then in the hallway, then removed every alarm. The conclusion was inescapable. It had been meticulously planned to offer no warning and no escape. Outside, a neighbor approached hesitantly, eyes red from crying. "She was so friendly once," they murmured, voice trembling with disbelief. "We all knew she'd been having problems, but not this. We would have helped if we'd known." Their words lingered with Ortiz. Could something have been done? A mental health commitment? A neighbor's intervention? Child protective services? The detective had seen countless tragedies, but the death of a child always ignited deeper questions about responsibility and prevention. As dusk fell, Ortiz stood in the yard, gazing at the blackened husk of what had been a family's home. An ambulance had taken away the youngest victim's life hours earlier, yet the echo of her final gasps still weighed heavily. No matter the legal outcome for Roconda, the irrevocable loss of a child was a wound the community and Ortiz would not soon forget. The days after the 12-year-old girl's death were a blur of legal filings, court dates, and a city drowning in sorrow. Roconda Singleton, hair matted by anxiety and posture slumped, stood arraigned on charges of first-degree arson, second-degree murder, and child abuse. The haunting finality of a young life cut short weighed heavily on the community, fueling both grief and anger. In the packed courtroom, reporters, neighbors, and curious onlookers fixed their attention on Roconda as she faced the judge, her eyes hollow with resignation. Grand Rapids Police Chief Eric Dalton spoke briefly to the media, urging patience. "This is a devastating case. Our hearts go out to the victims." Detective Ortiz sat in the gallery, recalling the evidence that led them here: the removed smoke detectors, the receipt for lighter fluid, the chilling medical report confirming the girl died from severe smoke inhalation. Roconda's mental health evaluations painted a grim picture: a mother convinced the only escape was to burn down her home, taking her children with her. While her defense argued diminished capacity, prosecutors pointed to her methodical actions, stripping the house of alarms and deliberately using accelerant. The clash between mental illness and criminal responsibility dominated the evening news. Weeks passed in somber anticipation. Neighbors held candlelight vigils outside the blackened home, leaving flowers and handwritten notes for the lost child. The two surviving siblings, placed under protective care, struggled to cope with nightmares and endless questions. Some demanded the harshest punishment possible. Others blamed a failing system that never intervened in Roconda's mounting mental health crisis. Throughout the trial, Detective Ortiz couldn't shake the memory of firefighters carrying the unconscious girl from the flames. Each witness recounting the blaze, the mother's talk of doom, the methodical preparation, underscored how preventable it all might have been. On the final day, the courtroom fell silent as the jury returned with a verdict: guilty of second-degree murder. Roconda stared straight ahead, her face a mask of sorrow and detachment. The judge imposed a life sentence, leaving only a faint possibility of parole. An uneasy murmur rippled through spectators. Some saw justice served, while others mourned a family ravaged by despair. Photographers crowded outside, seeking statements from anyone who would speak. In a brief press encounter, Ortiz voiced both resolve and regret. "No act that endangers a child can go unpunished," he said, "but we also need to recognize warning signs sooner." As he stepped away from the glare of cameras, an unsettling truth clung to him. No legal resolution could bring back the girl who died gasping for air. That night, the quiet hush returned to the neighborhood. A small gathering of mourners placed fresh flowers against the scorched foundation, streetlights illuminating the skeletal remains of what was once a home. Ortiz drove past slowly, thinking of the lost daughter and how a mother's anguish spiraled into tragedy. In the end, the verdict felt less like closure and more like a solemn warning. When desperation and mental illness are ignored, the spark can claim far more than a single life.